So in this module, we're going to look at imperialism, in particular new imperialism, and we're going to compare it to other forms of older colonialism. So what is imperialism? Well, the definition that we're going to use for class is that imperialism is basically the European policy of dominating the globe through economic exploitation and political rule. Now, we've already seen the Europeans begin to expand back in the 15 and 1600s during the discovery and conquest of the New World and the explorations that took them into Asia. But when we get to the late 19th century, we see another massive push to spread European power and to really dominate the entirety of the globe, if possible. And the image that you kind of get from this newer form of imperialism is that of one you can see here on this slide, like an octopus reaching its tentacles out to touch everything. And here we have England. They've got their hands on Egypt and India and Canada and basically South Africa, Gibraltar, Malta, Spain, Cameroon, Ireland. England really becomes to be everywhere. And it's a really good image for the time period because Europeans, really, and the Americans to a lesser extent, but still somewhat, are going to try and become engaged in trying to take over other parts of the world, mainly in Asia and in Africa. Now, this imperialism that emerges in the late 1800s is a bit different from earlier forms of imperialism that we've actually talked about already. So when the Europeans first begin the process of expanding, they end up coming mainly to areas like the Americas, and they start to set up what are known as white settler colonies. So these are colonies where they're sending Europeans abroad to set up a colony. They're going to transplant their European politics, their European culture, and they're also going to create a kind of a mini Europe on another part of the world. So if you think about the United States, we have a lot of places that have the word new in front of them, right? If you think about it, New York, New Hampshire, New Jersey, right? And these are just, named after other places that are in Europe because they're just transplanting Europe to the United States. It's not, of course, just as easy as that, though, right? We do see basically white Europeans traveling abroad to the United States, but we also see them in Australia and in South Africa, and they begin to rule those areas like a European state. And so we're kind of already familiar with this form of imperialism. And there's another form of early imperialism that we've already alluded to, but haven't really discussed in great detail. These were merchant colonies. They were founded and run by businesses. So two good examples here would be India. In India, the British are going to take the East India Company and use them to basically begin the process of settling India. And they send members of the trading company who are going to make treaties with the local Indian rulers. And then over time, they're going to extend their power to the point where the British East India Company basically begins to rule India on its own. And this was going to continue really until we get to the 1850s when there becomes a rebellion against the British East India Company. And so after that, they call for help from the British Crown, and they ask to send military troops. And after that, the British government is basically going to take over the colony. But for a while, the entire country of India was basically being run by a company for their own economic purposes, which is kind of crazy. Another example of the merchant colony would be the Dutch East India Company going into Indonesia. Again, it's basically a colony that's set up by this merchant company. The company is the one who runs it, and again is going to end up getting into trouble with the locals who don't want to be, just assets in a company. And then the government is going to have to step in and take over. But these are the two older forms of colonialism that we see. Now, the merchant colonies and the white settler colonies are being developed as early as the 15 and 1600s. But the other form of imperialism we start to see develop in the early 1800s is called the informal colony. Informal colonies are areas of the globe that are politically independent but are economically dominated by Western powers through basically unequal treaties. Now, this was kind of America's way of doing stuff here. Oh, we're not taking over them. We're not making them a colony or annexing them. You know, they're not part of our country. We're just going to control everything they do because we control all the economic interests there. The best example, however, of an informal colony in the 1800s is China. Now, Europeans have been interested in China for quite some time because China has a lot of trade goods that they want. In fact, this was one of the main reasons for the start of the age of exploration, if you remember, back in the early modern period, because they didn't have the trade goods coming from China, right? And so, the biggest thing that once they begin trading with them, one of the biggest things that the Europeans discover that's going to be a major trade good coming out of China is actually opium. Yeah. We figure out, hey, drugs are good. So we begin bringing opium into the country to China, and people end up getting hooked, and obviously, because there's a lot of them there and life's not great, so we get them hooked on opium, and then we're going to get them all hooked, and then we're going to do whatever we want. Well, the Chinese government decides to ban the importation of opium because, everybody on opium is, dying and useless. Basically, we got the entire country of China hooked on heroin. So, yeah, I guess all this fentanyl coming out of China, maybe it's like payback. Maybe that's how they see it. They see it as payback for the opium wars. But anyways, the British are like, no, but we're making a lot of money selling drugs to your people and getting them hooked, right? And so they decide to go to war with China. And so, the British are going through the Industrial Revolution. They have military weapons and ships, and they're far more technologically advanced than the Chinese. They're able to defeat the Chinese in the opium wars of the 1840s and 50s. And as a consequence, they forced China to sign several very unequal treaties with Britain, which gives merchants the right to trade in parts of China that the emperor does not want them to trade in. Now, these treaties do not make China a colony of Great Britain. The emperor was still technically in charge of the country. But through these treaties, the British are able to gain the upper hand economically and to make sure that the goods that we're going to be importing into China would not be heavily taxed, so that they would be able to compete very well in the Chinese market. And does anybody know what that's called when what they did there? They established a term that we still kind of use today in economics. Well, that too, but the idea that that you set up a trade policy that basically means that, you're going to tax some people, but you're not going to tax me because we have a good treaty. Y'all know what that's called? It's called most favored nation status. Y'all have heard of that? Most favored nation? So we basically set up this most favored nation is basically like our Britain does, and they're like, you don't tax British goods, but you tax everybody else's because we're the best. And we beat you in war. We're the most favored nation kind of thing. We see other European powers, though, see how this is going to work, and they very quickly do that as well. Germany and Russia and France are also interested in dividing China into spheres of influence where they can economically dominate as well. Even Japan gets involved in this, and we'll talk about Japan later. But Japan is going to be very interested in China as well. So China is going to remain independent politically, but economically is falling under control of the West. And you see here, they're basically kind of carving it up. Once we get to the late 1800s, around 1875, we see that Europeans have become heavily involved in imperialism. And historians have actually called this time period new imperialism. And it's because it's being caused by new factors. But also it's going to have different impacts than the first wave of imperialism, just straight colonialism or mercantilism. All right, so what we what are some of these new causes for the explosion of imperialism as it happens in the late 1800s? Well, one of the primary causes is industrialization. By the late 1800s, Europeans have really gone through first wave industrialization. Many of them are involved now in the second industrial revolution, and it means that they're going to need access to raw materials to build their products and new markets to sell their products in. And if you look at this here, you can see a group of men riding bicycles because bicycles becomes a major craze in the 1800s. The working class has a little bit more income. They're able to spend it on things like bicycles for leisurely activities and enjoyment, take rides in the countryside. But as bicycle technology improves, they're going to learn that if you create the tires out of rubber, it makes for a smoother kind of ride. But in order to get rubber, you need to go to parts of the world in Asia and Africa that have access to natural rubber. And so it's one of these, desires for raw material that's going to encourage Europeans to expand imperially, because they discover that if they control the country politically, it makes it a whole lot easier to extract the raw materials that they need. They can take those raw materials, turn them into finished products, and the more countries they control, the more markets they have to sell those goods. So industrialization becomes a major factor pushing this new wave of imperialism. And it's not just simply economics that are going to be driving this. It's also political. And this is where nationalism kind of starts to come into play. So you saw the rise of nationalism, and the impacts is it creates these national rivalries. And these new nations of Europe are trying to compete with each other and figure out which one of them is the most powerful. And one of the ways that a nation can show how powerful it is it's going to increase how many colonies it has. And so it's going to increase your nation's status. And so they're going to start trying to increase colonies and create and control and have power. And then lastly, you have social reasons. This, desire to prevent class conflict. And, industrialization had created a lot of working class conflict and fear. We talked about that during the Victorian era, right? That the upper middle class feared the lower classes rising up. So they wanted to prevent any kind of emerging class conflict. And so the best way to do that would be to unite the classes together through imperialism. And imperialism is going to be incredibly popular. It's a kind of way of bringing the whole country together, because even if you're not as well off as me, well, maybe you could still think of yourself as better off than those people in those colonies, right? And so imperialism is going to come about because of industrialization, nationalism, and social aspects. All right. From 1875 to 1914, we're going to see Europeans triple the amount of land that they dominate. There's two main areas where they're going to expand, and that's going to be Southeast Asia. And the reason they go to Southeast Asia is for products that Europeans are interested in, right? There's rubber, which we already mentioned. It's also going to provide tires for cars and all this stuff. Asia is also going to have commodities like rice and sugar and coffee, which are going to become staple goods within Europe. And Europeans are very interested in expanding there so that it can control these areas, and they basically end up taking over most of Southeast Asia. One area that remains independent is Thailand, however. And at this point in history, though, it's better known as the Kingdom of Siam. And the king became Mongkut, King Mongkut of Siam, westernizes and he's able to prevent the Europeans from taking over. And you can see him here, he's standing here, very, very in European style clothing, very westernized. And so he's able to prevent them from taking over. Now, Mongkut ends up having his children are educated by European instructors. In fact, one of the instructors was a woman named Anna Lenowens, and she becomes the English tutor to some of Thailand's princes, and that was actually portrayed in a Broadway musical. Her experience there, called The King and I. No, anybody? It's a movie. It's pretty popular and well known. So, Anyways, yeah, it doesn't become controlled, and so the King Mongkut is able to remain politically independent. He does have to take some kind of marching orders, economically speaking, from the Europeans. This map just kind of shows you a nice visual of the expansion of imperialism into Southeast Asia and the Pacific. You can see, of course, the British are in places like India and Australia. If you look on the map, particularly Southeast Asia, you can see the French are in Indochina, which we then eventually begin to call Vietnam, right? And Laos and Cambodia. The French kind of take over there. You have the British in Burma. You have, the Kingdom of Siam here, which is able to stay independent. But, you can clearly see that the European powers are basically dividing up all of this land however they want. Not only are Europeans expanding into Asia, but also Africa. There's really a scramble for Africa because it has a lot of products that they're interested in. There's gold, there's timber, there's rubber. Africa has palm oil, which can be used as machine lubricant. It's also used as a base for cosmetics. So part of the cosmetics industry, if you ever used a product, that got its name from palm oil, it probably came out of this